On the evening of December 16, 1985, a bitter winter cold descended over Midtown Manhattan like a shroud. Inside a black Lincoln Continental pulling up to Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street at precisely 5:26 p.m., Paul Castellano, the 70-year-old boss of bosses who controlled a criminal empire worth hundreds of millions from a palatial fortress on Staten Island, stepped onto the frozen pavement. 6 bullets tore through his skull and chest before his body collapsed beneath the glittering Christmas lights strung above the restaurant entrance. The most powerful crime lord in America died on a Manhattan sidewalk, blood pooling in the snow, 15 miles from the White House he'd built to prove he was untouchable. But long before the assassination, before the FBI wiretaps hidden in bedroom walls, before the betrayal that would destroy an empire, the mansion at 177 Benedict Road had been keeping secrets. Secrets whispered in soundproofed rooms. Secrets shared between a crime boss and the housekeeper who would destroy him. Secrets that built a palace and turned it into a tomb. This is the story of the house that crowned a king, and the king who never saw the executioner coming. But before the 33,000-square-foot mansion on Tot Hill, before the Italian Carrara marble and crystal chandeliers worth millions, before the title Boss of Bosses and the power to order death with a phone call, there was a butcher's son learning that honest work makes you poor and power makes you rich. June 26, 1915. Constantino Paul Castellano entered the world in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. Born to Giuseppe and Concetta Castellano, Sicilian immigrants who'd arrived in America carrying nothing but hope wrapped in newspaper. Giuseppe owned a cramped butcher shop on 86th Street, a place that smelled of blood and sawdust, where he sold pork chops and Italian sausages to neighborhood families who haggled over pennies. The work was brutal. The profit was almost nothing. Young Paul watched his father's hands crack and bleed from handling frozen meat in the winter, watched him bow and scrape to customers who treated him like a servant, watched him count coins at the end of 16-hour days that left him too exhausted to speak. Giuseppe Castellano worked himself to the bone and died with nothing. It would become Paul's foundational truth. But the Castellano family had connections that went deeper than the butcher shop's blood-stained floor. Giuseppe wasn't just a butcher trying to survive in Brooklyn. He was an early member of the Mangano crime family, the criminal organization that would eventually evolve into the Gambino empire. Paul's destiny was being carved long before he understood what destiny meant. His first cousin, Carlo Gambino, was a thin, soft-spoken Sicilian with patient eyes and a mind that calculated profit like an accountant and violence like a general. Carlo was rising through the ranks of organized crime, building relationships, making himself indispensable, waiting for the moment to strike. In 1932, when Carlo married Paul's sister Catherine, the families merged in blood and business. The union wasn't just family. It was succession planning decades before the throne was even empty. Paul Castellano's criminal education began in the 1930s through the low-level rackets that fed Brooklyn's underworld: numbers running, loan sharking, truck hijackings in the industrial corridors where legitimate businesses feared to operate. But Paul was different from the other young mobsters who relied on fists and intimidation. He'd learned something valuable in his father's butcher shop: understand supply chains, control distribution, and you control everything. Violence was a tool. Economics was the weapon. In the 1950s, Castellano launched Dial Poultry, a poultry distribution company that appeared, on paper, to be completely legitimate. Behind the business licenses and tax filings, Dial Poultry was something else entirely: a criminal enterprise that supplied 300 butchers across New York City through a combination of strategic partnerships and brutal intimidation. Castellano understood leverage. Supermarket chains like Key Food and Waldbaum's needed reliable poultry suppliers. Dial Poultry was reliable. Refuse to buy from Dial, and your deliveries mysteriously stopped arriving. Your workers went on strike. Your store caught fire. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. The meat business made Paul Castellano his first $1 million. It would eventually be worth tens of millions more. But more importantly, it proved something to Carlo Gambino and the other bosses watching from Brooklyn social clubs. Paul Castellano was an earner, not just a soldier. He made money quietly, avoided newspaper headlines, wore expensive tailored suits, and spoke like a businessman negotiating contracts rather than a gangster ordering executions. He was the future of organized crime, whether the old-school gangsters realized it or not. By 1957, the Mafia landscape was shifting like tectonic plates. Albert Anastasia, the boss of what would become the Gambino family, was murdered on October 25th in the barber shop of the Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan. Shot to death while reclining in a barber's chair, his face covered in hot towels, never seeing the gunman approach. Carlo Gambino, the patient strategist who'd waited decades for his moment, seized control of the family. Anastasia's reign had been built on violence and fear. Gambino's empire would be built on something more sustainable: money, corruption, and political influence. Carlo promoted Paul Castellano to capo, then consigliere, trusting him with the family's most lucrative operations: construction, trucking, labor unions, the concrete industry that was quite literally building modern New York City. Every skyscraper that rose in Manhattan, every bridge that connected the boroughs, every major infrastructure project, the Gambino family collected tribute through rigged bids, inflated prices, and concrete suppliers who had no choice but to cooperate. The largest construction projects in New York history, the Jacob Javits Convention Center, Trump Tower, luxury developments across the city, all paid the invisible tax that flowed into Gambino family coffers. Paul Castellano became wealthy beyond his father's imagination. The butcher's son, who'd watched Giuseppe bleed for pennies, now controlled operations worth hundreds of millions annually. He bought homes in Brooklyn, then Manhattan, then estates that announced to the world he'd transcended the immigrant poverty that had killed his father. Then came October 15th, 1976. Carlo Gambino died of natural causes at his home at age 74, his heart finally giving out after decades of stress, secrets, and the weight of commanding an empire. In his final instructions, shocking nearly everyone in the organization, Carlo named Paul Castellano, not underboss Aniello Neil Della Croce, not a traditional street soldier forged in violence, as the next boss of the Gambino crime family. The decision fractured the organization immediately. Castellano represented everything the old-school gangsters despised. He was a businessman who avoided violence when possible, who wore $3,000 suits and attended charity galas, who spoke about legitimate business investments and real estate holdings. He represented the new Mafia, where profit mattered more than blood, where white-collar crime replaced robbery and extortion. Della Croce represented the old ways: loyalty forged through violence, respect earned through fear, tradition maintained through brutal enforcement. To prevent civil war, Castellano made Della Croce underboss and allowed him to control traditional rackets like gambling, loan sharking, and robbery. But Castellano kept the profitable operations for himself: construction, labor unions, the legitimate businesses that generated the real money. The compromise worked. Barely. Because Paul Castellano had plans that extended far beyond controlling Brooklyn warehouses and Queens gambling operations. He wanted to build a kingdom, and every king needs a castle that announces his power to the world. In 1980, at the absolute height of his power and wealth, Paul Castellano purchased 1.75 acres of land atop Tot Hill on Staten Island, the highest natural point on the eastern seaboard south of Maine, a location so elevated that on clear days you could see 3 states and the entire New York harbor spread below like a kingdom awaiting conquest. The location wasn't accidental. Tot Hill was where New York's elite built their estates, where judges and corporate executives and old money families lived behind iron gates and manicured hedges, isolated from the poverty and violence that made their wealth possible. Here, in this enclave of power, Paul Castellano would build something unprecedented. He paid cash, no mortgage, no bank involved. Then he hired architects and construction crews with a single instruction that seemed insane in its audacity. Build me the White House. Not a house that resembled the White House in Washington, D.C., a house that was the White House. A perfect replica, in style and grandeur, a 33,000-square-foot Mediterranean revival palace that would stand as an architectural declaration. The symbolism was deliberate and impossible to miss. If the President of the United States lived in the White House in Washington, then the boss of bosses would live in the White House of Staten Island. If legitimate power resided in marble halls protected by the Secret Service, then illegitimate power would reside in marble halls protected by armed soldiers who'd proven their loyalty through blood. Construction took 3 years and cost over $4 million, equivalent to more than $15 million today. No expense was spared, no detail overlooked. The exterior featured brilliant white stucco walls that gleamed in sunlight like a beacon visible for miles, terracotta barrel tile roofing imported from Italy, and towering white columns flanking the main entrance that evoked classical Roman power. The mansion sat on the hilltop like a crown, announcing to everyone below that Paul Castellano had transcended the butcher shop, transcended Brooklyn, transcended the limitations that poverty had placed on his father. But the exterior, as impressive as it appeared, was merely the facade. The true excess lived inside. Every major surface throughout the mansion gleamed with Italian Carrara marble, the same marble Michelangelo selected from the quarries of Tuscany to carve the David, the same marble that lined the Pantheon in Rome. Thousands of square feet of marble covered the floors, walls, staircases, and columns, each slab selected for its perfect white coloring and delicate gray veining. The cost of the marble alone exceeded $500,000, but cost was irrelevant. The marble was a statement. Paul Castellano walked on the same stone as Renaissance masters and Roman emperors. Crystal chandeliers imported from Europe hung in every major room, each weighing hundreds of pounds, each containing thousands of hand-cut crystals that refracted light into rainbows across the marble floors. The chandeliers had been commissioned from craftsmen in Austria and France, designed specifically for the mansion's proportions, each one a work of art that cost more than most Americans earned in a year. The mansion contained 8 bedrooms, each larger than typical Brooklyn apartments, each with private bathrooms featuring gold-plated fixtures, heated marble floors, and custom tile work. But numbers alone couldn't capture the excess. One bathroom featured a bathtub carved from a single block of marble weighing over 2,000 pounds. Another contained a shower with 17 adjustable jets and a built-in steam system. These weren't bathrooms. They were temples to indulgence. 17 bathrooms total throughout the mansion. Some speculated the number was deliberate. one bathroom for each of Paul Castellano's most trusted capos, a symbol that even bodily functions in the White House were orchestrated hierarchically. Others believed it was simply excess for excess's sake, a billionaire's refusal to ever wait for an available bathroom. Either way, the number became legendary in law enforcement circles and criminal lore. The mansion's centerpiece was the Olympic-sized indoor pool. Not a typical residential pool, but a competitive-length swimming facility lined with hand-painted Italian tiles depicting scenes from Roman mythology. Neptune rising from the waves. Diana hunting in marble forests. Gods and mortals frozen in ceramic glory. The pool room featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the English gardens, a retractable glass ceiling that opened to the sky on warm days, and marble columns that made the space feel like a Roman bathhouse transported through time. Castellano swam laps every morning at 6 a.m., 50 laps without stopping, a disciplined routine he maintained religiously. His doctor had recommended swimming to manage his diabetes and heart condition, but the pool served another purpose. It was where Castellano thought, planned, strategized. The repetitive motion of swimming freed his mind to calculate, to plot, to see patterns others missed. Many of his most important decisions, including who lived and who died, were made during those solitary morning swims in the temple he'd built to his own power. Outside, the English gardens sprawled across the property like a painting made real. Castellano had hired landscape architects from England to design gardens in the classical British style, hedge mazes, stone fountains, statuary, depicting Greek philosophers and Roman generals, rose beds containing flowers imported from Italy that bloomed in colors found nowhere else in Staten Island. At the center stood a gazebo built from imported teak, a place where Castellano could sit surrounded by beauty and survey his kingdom spread below, the Verrazzano Narrows Bridge connecting Staten Island to Brooklyn, the New York harbor dotted with ships, the Manhattan skyline rising in the distance like the spires of a conquered city. The gardens required a staff of 6 full-time groundskeepers who worked in rotating shifts to maintain the hedges, flowers, fountains, and lawns with military precision. Every blade of grass was cut to exact specifications. Every flower was tended daily. The gardens weren't just landscaping. They were proof that Paul Castellano controlled nature itself, bending it to his aesthetic vision through money and manpower. But beneath the beauty and excess, the White House was something else entirely. It was a fortress. The mansion's walls were reinforced with steel and concrete, thick enough to withstand bullets from rifles and submachine guns. Engineers had designed the structure to resist forced entry, with reinforced doorframes, impact-resistant windows, and structural supports that could survive explosions. Every ground floor window featured bulletproof glass imported from Germany, each pane costing thousands of dollars, each one tested to withstand repeated impacts from high-caliber weapons. Security cameras monitored every angle of the property, feeding live footage to a dedicated security room on the first floor where guards watched screens 24 hours a day. The cameras weren't visible from the outside. They were disguised as architectural features, hidden in columns and roofline details, creating the illusion of an open, welcoming estate while actually surveilling every approach. The gatehouse at the entrance was manned continuously by armed guards, former Gambino family soldiers who'd proven their loyalty through decades of service and violence. They knew every car that belonged on the property, every face that had permission to enter. Approach without authorization, and you were met with cold eyes and weapons that remained hidden but ready. The guards maintained logs of every visitor, every delivery, every person who passed through the gates. Nothing happened at the White House without being recorded, documented, controlled. A state-of-the-art alarm system connected directly to private security firms, not the police, whom Castellano neither trusted nor needed. The alarms could detect motion, heat, pressure changes, glass breaking, door openings, any disturbance in the mansion's carefully controlled environment. Trigger an alarm, and armed response teams arrived within minutes, prepared for war. And hidden throughout the structure, accessible only through concealed panels and locked doors, were soundproofed meeting rooms where the real business of the Gambino crime family was conducted. These rooms represented the mansion's true purpose. They weren't bedrooms or entertaining spaces. They were war rooms, boardrooms, judgment halls where the fate of men and the distribution of millions were decided. The soundproofing was state-of-the-art for 1980, with walls containing multiple layers of acoustic insulation, specialized drywall designed to absorb sound, and doors that sealed with rubber gaskets like bank vaults. A conversation inside these rooms couldn't be heard from outside, even if someone pressed their ear against the wall. Here, in rooms the FBI wouldn't discover for years, Paul Castellano conducted the business of the Commission, the governing body that united America's 5 major Mafia families in an uneasy alliance of profit and territorial respect. Here, sitting at a conference table that cost more than most houses, Castellano negotiated with bosses from the Genovese, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno families. They divided territories, sanctioned murders, resolved disputes, and coordinated the criminal operations that infected every aspect of New York commerce. The largest construction projects in the city, the Jacob Javits Convention Center that cost $486 million. Trump Tower that rose on Fifth Avenue like a monument to excess, the renovation of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, all paid tribute to the Gambino family through rigged concrete bids and inflated construction costs. The system was elegant in its simplicity. Contractors who wanted to win bids bought concrete exclusively from Gambino-controlled suppliers at artificially high prices. Refuse, and your bids were mysteriously rejected. Your workers faced union problems. Your equipment suffered inexplicable mechanical failures. The concrete industry in New York was the Gambino family's private profit center, generating tens of millions annually through what amounted to legal extortion. If this story is already pulling you in, type the word fortress in the comments below. Let's see how many are ready to enter the gates of power and betrayal. Castellano's personal sanctuary within the mansion was his private office on the 2nd floor, a wood-paneled room that felt more like a university library than a crime lord's command center. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, filled with leather-bound volumes on history, philosophy, and business management. Castellano had educated himself over decades, reading voraciously, believing that knowledge was another form of power that separated him from street thugs who relied solely on violence and intimidation. The office contained a massive mahogany desk from the 19th century, its surface polished to a mirror shine, its drawers containing ledgers that documented the Gambino family's legitimate and illegitimate operations. A floor safe hidden beneath a Persian rug held cash, documents, and the files Castellano maintained on every family member and associate, dossiers containing their strengths, weaknesses, earning capacity, and potential for betrayal. He trusted no one completely, not even the soldiers who'd sworn blood oaths to protect him. The office windows overlooked the bay, offering panoramic views that stretched to the horizon. On clear mornings, sitting at his desk with coffee prepared exactly to his specifications, Castellano could watch the sunrise paint the sky in colors that poets struggled to describe. These were the moments when he felt he'd achieved something beyond mere wealth. He'd achieved transcendence, escaping the limitations of his birth into a realm where beauty and power merged into something approaching art. He'd installed a private telephone line in the office with a scrambler device that encrypted conversations, making them theoretically impossible to intercept. The technology was cutting edge for 1980, designed by engineers who specialized in corporate espionage protection. Castellano could call Chicago, Miami, Las Vegas, and speak freely about murders, money laundering, political corruption, and territorial disputes. The scrambler transformed his voice into digital noise that required a matching decoder to understand. He believed the technology made him untraceable. He believed the soundproofed rooms made him unhearable. He believed the bulletproof glass made him unreachable. He believed the mansion's fortress construction made him invincible. He was wrong about everything. But he wouldn't discover the truth until it was far too late to save himself. By 1983, Paul Castellano had been living in the White House for 3 years, his empire generating profits that exceeded $100 million annually across dozens of legitimate and criminal enterprises. He was 70 years old, suffering from diabetes that required daily insulin injections, struggling with heart problems that made simple exertion exhausting, dealing with sexual dysfunction that had left him impotent for years. His body was betraying him even as his wealth grew. He lived in the mansion with his wife, Nina Mano, whom he'd married in 1937 when both were young and Brooklyn seemed like the entire world. They'd raised 4 children together, 3 sons and a daughter, all adults now, living separate lives, some estranged from their father's criminal empire and the violence that funded their comfortable existences. Nina, now in failing health herself, spent most days isolated in her private wing of the mansion, increasingly distant from her husband both physically and emotionally. Their marriage had long since ceased to be a partnership. It was an arrangement, a relic from a different era, maintained because divorce was impossible in their world. Castellano treated Nina with cold courtesy, ensuring she had everything money could provide while offering nothing that money couldn't buy. She lived in golden isolation, a prisoner in a palace, surrounded by marble and crystal, while dying slowly from loneliness and the knowledge of what her husband truly was. Then Paul Castellano hired Gloria Olarte. A 34-year-old Colombian immigrant with limited English and the kind of beauty that age hadn't yet diminished. She came from poverty that made Brooklyn's tenements look luxurious, the kind of grinding generational poverty that crushes hope before it can even form. She'd immigrated to America, searching for the dream that everyone seeks and almost no one finds. Castellano hired her as a housekeeper and personal maid. Her duties were clearly defined. Clean the 17 bathrooms, polish the marble floors that showed every fingerprint and footprint, prepare meals in the industrial kitchen that could cater events for 50 guests, maintain the bedrooms, and disappear into the background like quality help was supposed to do. She moved into the servants' quarters on the 3rd floor, a small apartment that would have been luxurious to someone from her background, but was merely functional within the mansion's excess. What happened next was predictable in retrospect, though no one predicted it at the time. Paul Castellano, 70 years old, powerful beyond measure, isolated from genuine human connection by wealth and violence, saw something in Gloria Olarte that pierced through his defenses. Maybe it was her youth. Maybe it was her vulnerability. Maybe it was simply that she treated him like a man rather than a crime lord, unafraid because she didn't fully understand what he was capable of ordering. The affair began in 1983, conducted in secret within the master suite, while Nina Castellano remained in her wing of the mansion, either unaware or deliberately ignorant. For Paul Castellano, who hadn't been able to perform sexually in years due to his diabetes, the relationship represented something beyond physical desire. It represented reclaimed youth, vitality, power over life itself. His doctors had told him his sexual dysfunction was permanent. Gloria Olarte proved them wrong, and in that proving, she became more valuable to him than all the marble and crystal that surrounded them. For Gloria, the relationship was survival. You don't refuse the man who controls your employment, your housing, your entire existence in a country where you're vulnerable and replaceable. Whether she felt genuine affection for Castellano or simply understood the transactional nature of power dynamics between employer and employee is something only she knows. What's certain is that the affair violated every code of the Mafia world Castellano commanded. A boss did not bring shame to his family through obvious adultery. A boss did not lose control to desire, especially desire for someone so far beneath his social and criminal status. A boss did not allow an outsider, a woman, an immigrant, a nobody, into the inner sanctum where business was conducted and secrets were kept. But Paul Castellano, believing himself beyond the rules that constrained lesser men, continued the relationship openly within the mansion walls. The soldiers and capos who visited the White House noticed. They saw Gloria Olarte moving through the mansion with familiarity that exceeded her station. They saw how Castellano's eyes followed her. They heard rumors from the mansion staff about late-night visits to the master suite, about Nina's humiliation, about the boss of bosses acting like a fool over his housekeeper. The whispers spread through the organization like poison, eroding respect, creating contempt where there should have been fear. But behind these walls, something else was happening that no one in the Gambino family suspected. The FBI had penetrated the fortress that Paul Castellano believed was impregnable. The operation began in 1982, orchestrated by FBI agents who'd spent years trying to infiltrate the Gambino family through traditional methods, recruiting informants, surveilling known gathering places, wiretapping public phones. Every approach had failed. The family was too disciplined, too paranoid, too insulated by layers of soldiers and associates who'd rather die than cooperate with law enforcement. The Gambino family had survived decades of prosecutorial attacks because they understood the fundamental truth: stay silent, and the government can't prove anything. So the FBI tried something unprecedented and ethically questionable. They targeted Gloria Olarte. The exact details of how FBI agents approached Gloria remain partially classified, sealed in Justice Department files that won't be opened for decades. What's known from trial testimony and leaked reports paints a disturbing picture. FBI agents discovered Gloria's immigration status was questionable. She'd overstayed a visa, making her vulnerable to deportation. They discovered she had family in Colombia who depended on money she sent home monthly. They discovered she was completely isolated in America, with no friends, no support system. Nothing except her position in the Castellano mansion. Then they offered her a choice: cooperate with the FBI by allowing them to install listening devices throughout the mansion, or face deportation back to the Colombian poverty she'd risked everything to escape. It wasn't really a choice. It was coercion dressed as patriotic duty, a woman trapped between two powers that could destroy her completely: the FBI's legal authority and Castellano's criminal violence. Gloria Olarte agreed. Whether from fear, self-preservation, or genuine belief that she was doing the right thing by helping law enforcement dismantle a criminal organization, she became an FBI asset, a listening post inside the White House that no one suspected could exist. FBI technicians, working during hours when Castellano was away from the mansion and Gloria was the only person present, installed sophisticated listening devices throughout the structure. Microphones were hidden in the walls of the master bedroom, embedded in light fixtures and electrical outlets, practically invisible even during close inspection. Microphones were planted in Castellano's private office, hidden behind the books he read but never truly absorbed. Microphones were installed in the kitchen, where Gloria prepared meals while Castellano discussed business with visiting capos. Microphones were even planted in some of the soundproofed meeting rooms, penetrating the acoustic insulation that was supposed to make conversations impossible to intercept. The FBI had achieved what decades of investigations had failed to accomplish. They had ears inside the command center of the largest criminal organization in America. Every conversation Paul Castellano believed was private was being recorded by federal agents. Every business discussion, every murder conspiracy, every casual remark about illegal operations, all of it was flowing into FBI offices where transcripts were prepared, analyzed, and prepared for eventual prosecution. The wiretaps ran for months, collecting hundreds of hours of recordings that would later be described by prosecutors as the most damaging evidence ever compiled against a sitting crime family boss. The FBI heard Castellano discussing construction bid-rigging schemes that violated federal racketeering statutes. They heard him ordering union intimidation that violated labor laws. They heard him discussing murders, though always in coded language that skilled prosecutors would need to translate for juries. They heard him talking to other crime family bosses about commission business, proving the existence of the Mafia's ruling council that bosses had denied for decades. And they heard intimate conversations between Paul Castellano and Gloria Olarte, crude remarks about his restored sexual function, complaints about his wife, details about his medical conditions, personal vulnerabilities that would later be used to humiliate him in court and in newspapers. The boss of bosses, who'd built a fortress to protect his privacy and power, had been betrayed by the woman who cleaned his toilets and shared his bed. The FBI listened. The tapes rolled. And Paul Castellano, swimming his morning laps in the Olympic pool, conducting business in soundproofed rooms, sitting in his office overlooking the bay, had no idea that every word was being recorded for his eventual destruction. But paradise does not last forever. And in the criminal underworld, paradise lasts even less time than in legitimate society, because paradise attracts envy, resentment, and ambitious men who see weakness where others see strength. While Paul Castellano was building his White House and conducting his affair with Gloria Olarte, while he was swimming in his marble pool and hosting commission meetings in soundproofed rooms, another man was watching from Queens and Brooklyn, calculating, planning, waiting for the moment to strike. His name was John Gotti, and he represented everything Paul Castellano despised about the old Mafia. He was violent, flashy, beloved by soldiers, contemptuous of the businessman approach to organized crime. Gotti wore expensive suits, but moved like a street fighter. He spoke eloquently, but thought in terms of bullets and blood. He understood that respect in the criminal world came not from marble and crystal, but from the willingness to kill anyone who challenged your authority. The conflict between Paul Castellano and John Gotti had been simmering since 1976, when Castellano inherited the boss position that many believed should have gone to underboss Agnello Della Croce. Della Croce had brokered peace by accepting the underboss role and controlling traditional rackets, but the compromise satisfied no one. The Gambino family effectively split into two factions: Castellano's white-collar crew that operated out of the White House on Staten Island, and Della Croce's street soldiers who operated out of social clubs in Brooklyn and Queens. Gotti ran a crew in Ozone Park, Queens, specializing in hijacking, robbery, gambling operations, and, despite Castellano's explicit prohibition, heroin trafficking. The narcotics trade was incredibly profitable, but also incredibly dangerous from a legal perspective. Narcotics convictions carried mandatory minimum sentences that broke the loyalty of even hardened criminals. Facing 20 years in federal prison, men who'd never cooperated with law enforcement suddenly discovered their consciences and became government witnesses. Castellano had banned drug dealing by Gambino family members, threatening death for anyone who violated the prohibition. But the ban was impossible to enforce, and soldiers like Gotti saw it as evidence that Castellano had lost touch with reality. How could you forbid the most profitable criminal enterprise? How could you leave millions on the table while other families and street gangs seized the market? Gotti's crew dealt heroin through intermediaries and frontmen, generating enormous profits while technically maintaining deniability. When Castellano discovered Gotti's narcotics involvement in 1984, he summoned Gotti and several crew members to the White House for a meeting. The summons was ominous. When a boss calls you to his home, it means either promotion or execution, and context usually makes clear which one to expect. Gotti understood he was being called to answer for violating family rules, which meant potential demotion or death. Gotti never showed up for the meeting. Instead, he sent word through intermediaries that he was dealing with legal problems and couldn't leave Queens. The excuse was transparent nonsense, a deliberate insult that announced Gotti's contempt for Castellano's authority. In the Mafia world, refusing a boss's summons was tantamount to declaring war, a statement that you no longer recognized his power over life and death. Castellano, isolated in his mansion, believing his position made him untouchable, made a fatal mistake. He accepted Gotti's excuse and postponed the confrontation. A stronger boss would have ordered Gotti killed immediately for the disrespect. A smarter boss would have recognized that postponing confrontation gave Gotti time to organize resistance. Paul Castellano, comfortable in his marble palace, did neither. The situation deteriorated throughout 1984 and 1985. Federal prosecutors, armed with evidence from the White House wiretaps and other investigations, indicted Paul Castellano on charges of racketeering, conspiracy, and participation in an international stolen car ring. The indictment was devastating, detailing his control of the concrete industry, his manipulation of labor unions, his involvement in murders, and, most humiliatingly, his relationship with Gloria Olarte. The trial would expose the inner workings of the Gambino family, threaten the other 4 New York crime families through revelations about commission meetings, and bring unprecedented media attention to organized crime operations. Castellano, facing the possibility of spending his final years in federal prison, became increasingly paranoid and isolated. He stopped leaving the White House except for mandatory court appearances. He fired longtime associates he suspected of disloyalty. He demanded larger shares of family profits to pay his legal defense fees, which were approaching $3 million, an astronomical sum that bled the organization's resources. The soldiers who'd once respected Castellano's business acumen now saw him as a liability. He was draining family coffers to defend himself while providing nothing in return. No protection, no guidance, no leadership. He sat in his mansion like a king in a castle while his kingdom burned around him. And in the streets of Queens and Brooklyn, soldiers were asking dangerous questions. Why are we following a boss who's about to go to prison? Why are we paying tribute to fund his legal defense? Why are we loyal to someone who spends more time with his Colombian maid than with the family he's supposed to lead? John Gotti listened to these questions and provided answers. Castellano was weak. Castellano had lost touch. Castellano cared more about his White House than the soldiers bleeding for the family. Castellano had to go, and if the commission wouldn't sanction his removal, then the commission would be presented with a fait accompli, a new boss, and a choice between accepting reality or starting a war they might not win. But Gotti needed one more element to move against Castellano. He needed Agnello della Croce, the underboss who'd kept peace between the factions, to either support the hit or at least not oppose it. Della Croce was dying of cancer, spending his final days in agony, watching the family he'd served for 50 years tear itself apart. Then, on December 2, 1985, Agnello della Croce died at age 71. The buffer was gone. The man who could have prevented civil war was buried in a cemetery in Queens. John Gotti, now captain of the Bergen crew, with nothing between him and absolute power except Paul Castellano, saw his moment. According to Mafia law, the supposedly inviolable traditions that separated organized crime from street gangs, killing a sitting boss required approval from the commission. The 5 family bosses had to vote, considering the reasons, weighing the alternatives, ensuring that the hit wouldn't destabilize other families or attract federal attention. But Gotti understood that the commission would never approve killing Castellano. He'd made the other bosses wealthy through construction deals. He'd kept peace for nearly a decade. He had allies who'd defend him. So John Gotti made a decision that would define his reign and ultimately destroy him. He would violate Mafia law. He would kill a boss without permission. And he would do it so publicly, so brazenly, that the commission would have no choice but to accept the new reality or risk a war that could destroy all 5 families. The planning began in early December 1985. Gotti recruited 4 shooters from his crew, soldiers who'd proven their loyalty through years of violence, men who'd kill anyone for the right reasons, and no one doubted would complete the assignment. The target was obvious: Paul Castellano. The location was more complicated. Killing Castellano at the White House was impossible. The fortress was too well defended, with armed guards, security cameras, and bulletproof construction. They needed to catch him outside, in a public place, during a moment of transition when his guard was down. Gotti learned through family channels that Castellano had scheduled a meeting for December 16th at Spark Steakhouse in Manhattan. The meeting was routine. Castellano would discuss business with his designated successor as underboss, Thomas Bellotti, and several capos. The restaurant was in Midtown Manhattan, surrounded by holiday shoppers and Christmas decorations, about as public a location as possible. But that was precisely what made it perfect. A hit in broad daylight, in front of witnesses, in the heart of Manhattan would send an unmistakable message. John Gotti was bold enough, violent enough, and powerful enough to kill anyone anywhere. The plan was simple, but required perfect timing. The shooters would dress in identical trench coats and fur hats, disguising their faces while creating confusion. Witnesses would struggle to distinguish between 4 men dressed identically. They would position themselves near the restaurant entrance and wait for Castellano's Lincoln to arrive. The moment Castellano stepped out of the car, they would open fire, killing him and his driver Thomas Bellotti before either could draw weapons or take cover. Then they would disappear into waiting getaway cars driven by associates positioned around the block. Gotti would watch from a safe distance, establishing an alibi while ensuring the hit went smoothly. If anything went wrong, if Castellano survived, if the shooters were captured, if police responded faster than expected, Gotti could claim ignorance, deny involvement, and disappear into the crowds of Christmas shoppers flooding Manhattan. Everything was planned, Everything was prepared. All that remained was waiting for December 16th. Meanwhile, 15 miles away on Tot Hill, Paul Castellano woke in the White House on the morning of December 16, 1985, completely unaware that he had 14 hours left to live. He followed his normal routine, swimming 50 laps in the Olympic pool, eating breakfast prepared by Gloria Olarte, reviewing documents in his office while looking out over the bay. He had no sense of impending doom, no premonition of the bullets that were waiting for him in Manhattan. He was 70 years old, facing federal prosecution, struggling with health problems, but still convinced that his wealth and power would ultimately protect him. The White House stood as it always had, white stucco walls gleaming in the winter sun, marble glowing through the windows, Christmas decorations on the grounds announcing holiday cheer to the mansion that housed the headquarters of the largest criminal organization in America. Inside, 17 bathrooms sparkled with gold fixtures. 8 bedrooms remained pristine. The Olympic pool reflected morning light like liquid diamonds. The soundproofed meeting rooms stood silent, waiting for conversations that would never happen. Everything looked perfect. Everything looked secure. Everything looked like power and control. But beauty is always temporary. Power is always conditional. And fortresses, no matter how well constructed, can always be breached. Not through the walls, but through the gates. When the king voluntarily leaves his castle and steps into the world where bullets don't care about marble and crystal. This is where the fairy tale ends, and the nightmare begins. If you're on the edge of your seat, share this video with someone who needs to see how empires crumble and kings fall. They need to witness what comes next. At 5:15 p.m. on December 16, 1985, as winter darkness descended over Staten Island and Manhattan, Thomas Bellotti drove the black Lincoln Continental across the Verrazzano Narrows Bridge from the White House toward Midtown Manhattan. Paul Castellano sat in the passenger seat, wearing a tailored wool overcoat over his suit, reviewing handwritten notes for the evening meeting. The temperature had dropped below freezing. Snow from earlier in the week still lined the streets, dirty and frozen into gray ice. Christmas lights decorated buildings and lampposts, reflecting off the Lincoln's windows like distant stars. Traffic was heavy. The pre-holiday rush of office workers heading home, shoppers flooding the streets with bags full of gifts, tourists drawn to Manhattan's seasonal displays. The drive from Staten Island to Midtown Manhattan normally took 40 minutes. Today, in the congestion, it took nearly an hour. Castellano and Bellotti barely spoke during the drive. They'd known each other for decades, had conducted countless pieces of business together, had nothing left to say that required saying. At 5:26 p.m., Bellotti pulled the Lincoln into a parking space directly in front of Sparks Steakhouse at 210 East 46th Street between 2nd and 3rd Avenues. The restaurant was Castellano's favorite in Manhattan, upscale but not pretentious, known for quality steaks and discreet service that didn't ask questions about the men conducting business at corner tables. Castellano had eaten there dozens of times, always arriving early, always leaving before crowds made him feel exposed. The street was crowded with pedestrians hurrying past in heavy coats, heads down against the cold. Christmas decorations hung from the buildings and light posts. Salvation Army bell ringers solicited donations on the corners. Office workers rushed toward subway stations. Everything was normal, unremarkable, a typical December evening in Manhattan. 4 men in identical trench coats and fur hats stood near the restaurant entrance, looking like businessmen waiting for colleagues, indistinguishable from the thousands of well-dressed professionals flooding Manhattan every evening. No one noticed them. No one recognized the bulges under their coats where handguns were concealed. No one saw them tense when the Lincoln pulled up. Thomas Bellotti opened the driver's door and stepped onto the sidewalk, moving around the front of the car toward the passenger side where Castellano was preparing to exit. Standard procedure: the driver opens the boss's door, checks the surroundings, provides a moment of protection during the vulnerable transition from car to building. But there was no protection. There was only execution. The first shooter approached Bellotti from behind and fired 6 times with a handgun, 3 shots to the back, 3 to the head. Bellotti collapsed onto the frozen pavement, dead before he understood what was happening, blood spreading beneath his body like spilled oil, his final duty to protect Castellano interrupted by bullets that turned loyalty into a corpse. Paul Castellano, 70 years old, diabetic and struggling with mobility, heard the shots and understood immediately what was happening. He tried to stand, tried to run, tried to draw the weapon he carried, but rarely needed. He managed to get one leg out of the Lincoln before the second and third shooters arrived. They fired repeatedly into Castellano's head and chest. 6 bullets according to some witnesses, 7 according to others. Enough that it stopped mattering because each one alone could have been fatal. Castellano's body jerked with each impact, his expensive overcoat tearing, his blood spraying across the Lincoln's interior and the pavement where Christmas shoppers had walked moments before. He collapsed half in and half out of the car, his face destroyed by bullets, his final expression frozen somewhere between shock and resignation. The entire assassination took less than 30 seconds. The shooters fled to waiting cars positioned around the block, disappearing into Manhattan traffic before witnesses fully processed what they'd seen. People screamed. Someone called police. Pedestrians backed away from the bodies, creating a circle of space around the Lincoln where blood pooled and steamed in the freezing air. 1 block away. Sitting in a car with a clear view of Spark Steakhouse, John Gotti watched through binoculars. When both bodies were down, when the shooters had fled, when chaos erupted on East 46th Street, Gotti smiled. The king was dead. Long live the king. The execution scene became legendary in Mafia history and law enforcement lore. Photographs of Castellano's body beside the Lincoln, blood on the pavement beneath Christmas lights, the juxtaposition of holiday cheer and brutal murder, the boss of bosses lying dead in the street like any other shooting victim. The images ran in newspapers worldwide. Television news broadcasts showed the crime scene repeatedly. The FBI leaked details about Castellano's criminal empire, his White House mansion, his affair with his Colombian maid, ensuring that his death was humiliating as well as fatal. Back on Tot Hill, news of the assassination reached the White House before police arrived. Associates called the mansion with updates. Gloria Olarte, cleaning the kitchen where she'd cooked thousands of meals, received a phone call and collapsed screaming. Nina Castellano, confined to her bedroom, learned her husband was dead from staff members too shocked to deliver the news with proper delicacy. Within hours, FBI agents swarmed 177 Benedict Road with search warrants. They seized documents from Castellano's office, ledgers, files, the papers he'd kept in the floor safe documenting decades of criminal operations. They interviewed everyone present, including Gloria Olarte, whose cooperation with the FBI was about to become public knowledge that would make her a target for the rest of her life. They searched the soundproofed meeting rooms, the Olympic pool, the marble hallways, documenting everything for eventual prosecutions. The White House, built to project invincibility, designed to symbolize transcendent power, had become a crime scene, another piece of evidence in the federal government's war against organized crime. The fortress had failed its purpose. The king had died in the streets, and the palace stood empty, waiting for owners who would never arrive. In the days following the assassination, John Gotti assumed control of the Gambino family without approval from the commission, daring the other family bosses to challenge his authority. None did. They'd seen what happened to men who opposed John Gotti. They'd seen Paul Castellano lying dead outside Sparks Steakhouse. The commission, in a decision that would haunt them, ratified Gotti's coup after the fact, choosing pragmatism over principle, accepting the new boss rather than risking a war that could destroy all 5 families. Gotti's reign was everything Castellano's wasn't. Where Castellano had been discreet, Gotti was flamboyant. Where Castellano had avoided publicity, Gotti courted it, earning the nickname the Dapper Don for his expensive suits and confident stride past news cameras. Where Castellano had focused on white-collar crime, Gotti returned to the traditional rackets, gambling, loan sharking, robbery, that he understood, and the soldiers loved. Under Gotti, the Gambino family became more violent, more visible, and ultimately more vulnerable to federal prosecution. But Gotti's story is different from this one. This story is about the White House on Tot Hill, the mansion that was supposed to protect Paul Castellano, and instead announced his separation from the soldiers who might have saved him. Gloria Olarte testified before federal grand juries in the months following Castellano's death. Her testimony, combined with the wiretap recordings the FBI had collected, corroborated years of surveillance and provided prosecutors with the evidence needed to dismantle the Gambino family's construction rackets. The tapes were played in court, hours of Castellano discussing illegal activities, ordering violence, conducting business that violated dozens of federal statutes. The soundproofed rooms hadn't been soundproofed at all, just expensive illusions of security. Gloria entered the Witness Protection Program immediately after testifying, disappearing into a new identity somewhere in America, forever looking over her shoulder, forever haunted by the role she'd played in destroying the man whose bed she'd shared. Whether she'd been coerced by the FBI or had cooperated willingly became irrelevant. In the eyes of the Mafia, she was an informant, a rat, someone who deserved death regardless of her motivations. Nina Castellano never left the White House after her husband's murder. She remained in her wing of the mansion, her health deteriorating rapidly, destroyed not just by illness, but by the knowledge of Paul's affair, his criminal activities, and the violent death that ended 47 years of marriage. She died in 1987 at age 70, buried beside Paul in Moravian Cemetery in a plot that bore no mention of his criminal title or the empire he'd commanded. The mansion stood empty for months after Nina's death. Paul Castellano's children fought over ownership, none of them wanting the blood-stained inheritance, but all of them unwilling to let others claim it. Eventually, the property was sold in 1988 to a private buyer for $3.2 million, less than Paul had spent building it, less than it would cost to maintain it for a decade, a fraction of its actual value, because no one wanted to own the White House where the boss of bosses had lived before being executed in the streets. Over the following decades, the mansion changed hands repeatedly, each owner promising to restore its glory or honor its history, each owner leaving within a few years citing financial difficulties. Real estate agents developed euphemisms. The property had significant historical character and unique provenance, code words meaning it was a crime scene that no one wanted to touch despite its architectural magnificence. The mansion was renovated multiple times. Original furniture was removed and sold at auction. The English gardens were simplified into generic landscaping. The gatehouse was demolished, but the core remained. 33,000 square feet of Carrara marble and bullet-resistant construction, the Olympic pools, the soundproofed rooms, the architectural bones that couldn't be removed without demolishing the entire structure. Contractors working on renovations reported strange experiences, sounds in empty rooms, shadows in hallways, an oppressive atmosphere that settled over the property regardless of how much light streamed through the windows. Rational people don't believe in ghosts, but they also don't deny that certain places carry the weight of what happened within their walls. The White House had absorbed decades of criminal conspiracy, betrayal, and the final violent end of a man who'd believed marble could stop bullets. In 2024, the mansion was listed for sale at $18 million, making it the most expensive residential property in Staten Island history. The listing highlighted every luxury: the Carrara marble imported from Italy, the Olympic-sized pools, the panoramic views of New York Harbor, the historical significance as the former home of one of America's most powerful crime bosses. Real estate agents staged open houses, brought in photographers to capture the mansion in perfect light, created marketing materials that emphasized grandeur while downplaying the blood. For 1 year, the property remained on the market. Real estate agents brought dozens of potential buyers through the gates: foreign investors, real estate developers, wealthy families searching for Staten Island estates. Every buyer toured the mansion, admired the marble, calculated the property taxes approaching $200,000 annually, and then decided to purchase something else. The official explanations varied. The mansion was too large, too expensive to maintain, too isolated on Tot Hill. But insiders whispered the real reason. No one wanted to sleep in the bedroom where Paul Castellano had been betrayed by his housekeeper. No one wanted to conduct business in soundproofed rooms where the FBI had recorded everything. No one wanted to swim in the pool where an aging gangster had convinced himself that wealth equaled protection. In October 2025, after 12 months without a single serious offer, the White House was taken off the market. The owners, whoever they were, because property records were deliberately obscured through corporate shells, had apparently decided that waiting for a buyer was futile. The mansion sat empty, unused, a monument to ambition that had ended in assassination. But if you drive to Tot Hill today, if you find Benedict Road and follow it to the highest point on Staten Island, you can still see the White House exactly as Paul Castellano designed it, the white stucco walls gleaming in sunlight, the terracotta roof tiles imported from Italy, the columns flanking the entrance like sentinels guarding something already lost. The property is gated, surveilled by cameras, inaccessible to tourists and curiosity seekers. But from the road, you can glimpse the magnitude of what Castellano built, a palace designed to announce that a butcher's son from Brooklyn had transcended every limitation poverty and birth had placed upon him. The view from Tot Hill remains spectacular. The Verrazzano Narrows Bridge connecting Staten Island to Brooklyn, the New York Harbor dotted with ships, the Manhattan skyline rising in the distance like the spires of a city that killed the man who tried to control it. On clear days, you can see for miles in every direction. Surveying what might have been an empire if empires were measured in views rather than violence. Social media has discovered the mansion in recent years. Instagram accounts post photos of the exterior with captions about mob history and criminal architecture. TikTok users create videos claiming to have seen ghosts or heard unexplained sounds, feeding conspiracy theories about bodies buried in the gardens or secret rooms hidden in the basement. Urban explorers discuss strategies for breaching the security, though none have succeeded, and all would face serious legal consequences if they tried. The conspiracy theories have taken on lives of their own. Some claim Paul Castellano hid millions in cash somewhere in the mansion, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to search for it. Others insist the FBI never found all the listening devices, that microphones remain embedded in the walls, still recording though no one's listening anymore. The most persistent theory suggests bodies are buried in the English gardens, enemies who disappeared during Castellano's reign and were disposed of in the one place he controlled absolutely. During the 2024 renovation attempts, contractors did make a discovery that fueled the conspiracies. Behind the walls of one soundproofed meeting room, they found old wiring and electronic equipment, FBI listening devices that had never been removed, dormant for decades, still embedded in the structure like malignant tumors. The FBI had heard everything Paul Castellano believed was private. The fortress had been compromised from within. Penetrated by technology hidden in walls he trusted to protect him. Contractors also conducted ground-penetrating radar surveys of the property, standard procedure when planning major landscaping changes. The radar detected anomalies, hollow spaces beneath the gardens, areas where the soil density didn't match the surroundings, void spaces that could be explained by old utilities or could be something else entirely. The contractors recommended excavation to determine what was buried beneath the lawns that Castellano had tended with such obsessive precision. The owners refused. They sealed the report, terminated the renovation plans, and ensured the property returned to its locked, inaccessible state. Some secrets, they apparently decided, should remain buried. Some questions shouldn't be answered. Some truths are more dangerous than the speculation that surrounds them. Comment the word "buried" if you believe there's more beneath those gardens than anyone admits. Let's see who's brave enough to acknowledge what everyone suspects. Paul Castellano is gone now, dead for 40 years, his body buried in Moravian cemetery beneath a simple headstone that bears no mention of his title or power. John Gotti, who killed him, died in 2002 in a federal prison medical facility, destroyed by the same publicity he'd courted. Gloria Olarte vanished into witness protection, erased from history except in FBI reports and trial transcripts. Nina Castellano died humiliated and alone in a mansion she'd never wanted. The empire has crumbled, dismantled by RICO prosecutions that used evidence gathered from White House wiretaps, but the mansion remains. 33,000 square feet of Carrara marble and broken dreams, 17 bathrooms with gold fixtures that no one uses, 8 bedrooms where no one sleeps, an Olympic pool reflecting light through empty rooms, soundproofed meeting chambers where silence has replaced conspiracy, gardens hiding whatever the ground was given. The White House stands as a monument to a simple truth that wealth and power can never overcome. You cannot build walls thick enough to protect yourself from yourself. Paul Castellano believed the mansion would make him invincible, that bulletproof glass and armed guards and steel-reinforced construction could shield him from consequence. He was wrong. The fortress didn't protect him. It isolated him, separated him from the soldiers who might have warned him about John Gotti's ambitions, announced to the world that he valued marble more than loyalty. In the end, the palace became a prison. The sanctuary became a tomb. And the king died in the streets he thought he controlled, far from the marble halls that were supposed to guarantee immortality. The mansion will likely never sell. The price is too high, the history too dark, the symbolism too heavy. It will sit on Todd Hill for decades more, slowly deteriorating despite the best efforts of caretakers, becoming a ruins while still technically intact, a modern Gothic mansion that embodies everything wrong with the American dream when twisted by ambition and violence. If you visit Staten Island, if you drive through the wealthy neighborhoods of Tot Hill, you might catch a glimpse of the White House through the gates and trees. You'll see white walls that once symbolized power but now symbolize isolation. You'll see gardens that once displayed control over nature but now hide secrets. You'll see windows that once framed views of a conquered city but now stare blindly at a world that's moved on. And if you're sensitive to such things, if you believe that places absorb the emotions and events that occur within their walls, you might feel something else, an oppressive weight, a sense that you're being watched, a conviction that the mansion isn't truly empty, that something remains in the soundproofed rooms and marble hallways, waiting. The walls remember. They remember commission meetings where murders were sanctioned. They remember the affair between a crime boss and his housekeeper. They remember FBI agents installing microphones while everyone slept. They remember the moment Paul Castellano left for the last time, never suspecting that the White House couldn't protect him beyond its gates, that the fortress had no power in Manhattan streets where John Gotti's ambition was willing to violate every tradition and code to seize control. The White House on Tot Hill is real. The address is 177 Benedict Road. The property exists, though it's inaccessible to the public, and likely always will be. It's been featured in mob documentaries, true crime podcasts, and real estate articles about properties too infamous to sell. But it's more than a building, more than an architectural curiosity, more than a crime scene preserved by circumstance. It's a warning about what happens when you build your identity on wealth rather than relationships. About what happens when you mistake isolation for security. About what happens when you believe that power makes you untouchable, that marble can stop bullets, that fortresses protect kings rather than imprisoning them. Paul Castellano built the White House to prove he'd escaped his father's butcher shop, to announce his transcendence over the Brooklyn poverty that had crushed Giuseppe Castellano's dreams. But in building his palace, he forgot the fundamental truth that his father had understood. Survival isn't about comfort, it's about connection. Giuseppe had bled for his family. Paul bled for his mansion. And in the end, the mansion stood empty while Paul bled out on a Manhattan sidewalk, surrounded by Christmas shoppers who didn't know his name and wouldn't have cared if they did. The legacy of the White House isn't architectural magnificence or criminal history. The legacy is emptiness, a 33,000-square-foot void that no amount of marble or crystal can fill, a monument to ambition that succeeded at everything except the one thing that mattered, keeping its builder alive. If this story moved you, leave a comment below. Should the current owners excavate the gardens at 177 Benedict Road and uncover what's buried beneath the lawns, or should some secrets remain in the ground forever? What price do we pay for satisfying curiosity about darkness? And if you want to explore more hidden histories of America's most infamous estates, the mansions that housed criminals, the palaces that became prisons, the fortresses that failed their builders, subscribe for stories where architecture meets tragedy and wealth can't buy escape from fate. The White House stands empty on Tot Hill, waiting for nothing and no one, a testament to the truth that you can build walls, but you cannot build protection from ambition, betrayal, and the violence that destroyed the man who believed himself above both. The marble has cracks now, spreading slowly through the floors and walls, visible only to those who look closely. But the secrets don't crack. They don't fade. They don't surrender to time or investigation. They just wait. In the soundproofed rooms, in the gardens, in the hollow spaces beneath manicured lawns where ground-penetrating radar detected anomalies that no one will excavate, because some questions are more dangerous than any answer. And some mansions were never meant to be homes. They were always meant to be tombs for the ambitions that built them. The story ends. The mansion remains. And at 177 Benedict Road, on the highest point of Staten Island, the White House keeps its vigil, guarding secrets that died with Paul Castellano on a frozen Manhattan sidewalk 40 years ago. Secrets that wait, that listen, that remember everything the marble walls absorbed.